A politician betrays the trust of his people, but karma humiliates him publicly. Every election births new hope, and Victor Moretti embodied that hope for his people. Charismatic, tall, with piercing dark eyes and a voice that could sway even the most skeptical farmer, he promised a future of prosperity. Victor was no stranger to poverty. He had risen from it, or so he claimed. His speeches painted him as the son of the soil, a man who had struggled through hunger, studied by candlelight, and vowed never to let another child suffer as he once had. The citizens of Riverton believed him. They filled the squares waving banners with his name, convinced he was their savior. His opponents, wealthy aristocrats who had long controlled the region, mocked his origins but underestimated his determination. "The people deserve better," he declared during his campaign, "and I will bring honesty back to governance." The words rolled off his tongue with conviction, igniting passion in every corner of the nation. But behind closed doors, Victor had already begun weaving threads of deception. While the poor saw him as their champion, wealthy investors saw him as a puppet they could control. And Victor, hungry not just for leadership but for luxury, decided he would wear both masks. Victor's victory was monumental. The people danced in the streets, fireworks lit the sky, and tears of relief flowed from mothers who dreamed of better futures for their children. The humble man who had risen from nothing was now governor, sitting in an office draped in velvet curtains and golden chandeliers. At first he maintained the image of humility. He shook hands in crowded markets, wore plain shirts, and listened to citizens' cries. But soon temptation slithered its way into his heart. Businessmen flooded his office, offering gifts, money, and secret deals in exchange for favors. At first he hesitated, but the allure of wealth was irresistible. A single deal led to another, and then another. Victor's bank accounts swelled. He purchased mansions in hidden corners of the capital, imported foreign cars, and surrounded himself with luxury. His wife, Amelia, once modest and gentle, now adorned herself in jewels and designer gowns, enjoying the new life. But the people were slow to notice. Their trust was strong, and Victor's words still carried the rhythm of sincerity. Yet whispers began to rise. Teachers' salaries delayed, hospitals underfunded, and projects promised during his campaign never materialized. The cracks in his perfect mask had begun to show. The higher Victor climbed, the more dangerous his circle became. He allied with industrial magnates, men who cared little for the common good. Contracts for roads, schools, and water projects were handed to companies tied to his allies. Companies that barely built anything but siphoned millions into private accounts. Victor's speeches grew more extravagant, his promises even grander, but the citizens saw little progress. "The projects are underway," he would claim, showing glossy brochures and staged photographs. His words calmed the desperate, but only for a while. Meanwhile, journalists began digging. One paper published an exposé accusing him of siphoning funds meant for rural clinics. Victor responded with fury, calling it politically motivated lies. He used his influence to silence critics. Some were threatened, others mysteriously disappeared from public life. Fear replaced trust among those who once admired him. Still, Victor felt untouchable. His connections extended deep into law enforcement and the courts. Bribes ensured silence, and his enemies were outmaneuvered. To the public, he remained their governor. To the elites, he was their pawn. To himself, he was a king. But what Victor failed to see was that every secret deal, every bribe, every silenced voice was a thread tightening around his own neck. No reign of deceit lasts forever. As months turned to years, the suffering of the people grew undeniable. Farmers could not sell their crops because roads were never finished. Hospitals lacked medicine, leaving children to die of treatable illnesses. Teachers protested, demanding their wages. One winter evening, a woman named Clara stood in the town square with a sign that read, "Where is the governor's promise?" She was a widow, her husband lost due to a failing hospital, her son malnourished because of soaring food prices. Her act of defiance sparked something powerful. Soon, more citizens joined her, chanting, demanding answers. Victor watched from his office window as the protests grew louder. He dismissed them as temporary noise, convinced his power was too deeply rooted to be shaken. Amelia urged him to act cautiously, but Victor's pride blinded him. He sent guards to disperse the crowds, using tear gas and batons to silence their cries. Instead of fear, however, the people's anger intensified. Journalists, fueled by the unrest, found more evidence of corruption. International observers began to whisper about sanctions. Riverton, once a hopeful nation, had become a symbol of betrayal. Victor's empire was beginning to rot from within. The first true blow came from someone Victor trusted most, his deputy, Leonard. Ambitious and calculating, Leonard had grown weary of playing second fiddle. He had documented every illicit deal, every bribe, every offshore account Victor controlled, and when the protests reached their peak, Leonard struck. One morning, newspapers carried damning evidence, leaked contracts, photographs of Victor's secret estates, and detailed accounts of embezzlement. The headlines screamed betrayal. Citizens who once worshipped Victor now cursed his name. International news picked up the story, and Riverton became the subject of global ridicule. Victor denied everything, calling it slander from jealous rivals. But the evidence was too overwhelming. His allies, fearing their own exposure, abandoned him. His fortune, hidden in offshore accounts, was frozen. Amelia, terrified, begged him to step down, but Victor's pride refused. "I will not be humiliated," he snarled. But humiliation was already at his door. Protesters stormed the Capitol, chanting for his arrest. His once loyal guards hesitated, unsure whether to protect him or surrender him to the mob. For the first time in years, Victor felt fear. The empire he built on lies was crumbling, and karma had arrived, not with whispers, but with a roar. The courthouse was overflowing. Citizens crammed outside the gates, holding placards demanding justice. News reporters from across the globe swarmed the city, eager to capture the downfall of Riverton's once beloved leader. Inside, Victor sat at the defendant's table, his once commanding presence reduced to a hollow shell of arrogance. The charges read like a scroll of betrayal: embezzlement, fraud, bribery, misuse of public funds. The prosecution presented documents, recordings, and even testimonies from his former allies. One by one, those who once drank champagne in his mansion now stood against him to save themselves. Victor's lawyers argued tirelessly, painting him as a victim of political sabotage. But every shred of evidence tore that narrative apart. Amelia sat silently in the courtroom, her face pale, her jewels gone. She avoided Victor's eyes, ashamed of the empire she had once flaunted. The people, watching from television screens, felt a mix of anger and satisfaction. The man who had promised to be their savior had betrayed them, and now he stood exposed before the world. Yet, as damning as the trial appeared, whispers spread that Victor still had powerful strings to pull. Could a man so entrenched in corruption truly be brought down by mere justice? Behind the courtroom drama, Victor still plotted. From the confines of his guarded estate, he reached out to shadowy figures, businessmen, foreign allies, and old friends in high places. Money had always bought him protection, and he believed it could do so again. Late-night meetings took place in dimly lit hotel rooms, where his loyalists promised to fix the trial. Bribes were prepared, judges were approached, and witnesses were threatened. Victor's arrogance returned, whispering to him that he was invincible, that this too would pass as it always had. But what he didn't know was that Leonard, his betrayer, had anticipated every move. Leonard secretly fed information to investigators, ensuring every scheme Victor attempted was recorded. Bribed judges were exposed, frightened witnesses were placed under protection, and money trails were traced back to Victor himself. The more Victor tried to save himself, the deeper he dug his grave. His frantic attempts only confirmed his guilt in the public's eyes. Protesters outside the courthouse carried mock coffins painted with his name, chanting, "Bury corruption with him." Victor still believed he could outmaneuver fate, but fate, as it turned out, was already tightening its grip, preparing the stage for his public humiliation. Victor's wealth began to vanish like sand slipping through fingers. His accounts were frozen, his properties seized. The mansion he once boasted about was now surrounded by reporters, and his luxury cars were confiscated as evidence. Amelia, unable to bear the humiliation, left quietly, retreating to her family home. Business partners cut ties, fearing ruin by association. Even his personal guards deserted him, some secretly joining the protests for better pay. The palace of power he had built on lies was no more than an empty shell. But what crushed Victor most wasn't the loss of wealth, it was the loss of loyalty. Friends he had dined with, politicians who once bowed before him, now refused to take his calls. The isolation was suffocating. He wandered his nearly empty estate, staring at portraits of himself hung proudly on the walls, now symbols of arrogance and downfall. The people, once too fearful to speak against him, now shouted his name with venom. Children in the streets mocked him. Songs of corruption replaced the hymns of praise once sung in his honor. Victor, once seen as untouchable, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale unraveling in real time. The climax came on a cold, rainy morning. The court had reached its verdict, guilty on multiple counts. The sentence, decades in prison. But it wasn't the prison walls that broke Victor, it was the humiliation planned for him by karma itself. As he was escorted from the courthouse, cameras captured every moment. His once pristine suit was soaked in rain, his hair disheveled, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. protesters lined the streets throwing rotten vegetables, chanting curses, and holding signs that read, "Thief of the People." One man, a farmer who had lost his livelihood because of Victor's lies, stepped forward and spat at his shoes. The image was broadcast worldwide, a fallen leader disgraced by the very people he had betrayed. Victor tried to keep his composure, but the weight of thousands of eyes, the jeers, the laughter, and the cameras pierced through him. He realized in that instant that his legacy was sealed, not as a hero, not as a leader, but as the corrupt politician who had sold his soul for greed. The humiliation was complete. His downfall was no longer just political, it was eternal. Prison was a different world. Gone were the velvet curtains and golden chandeliers. Now Victor slept on a cold metal bed, ate tasteless meals, and shared space with criminals who mocked him. The man who once commanded armies of supporters now stood in line for food like everyone else. At first he demanded respect, insisting he was still powerful. But the guards laughed and inmates sneered. They reminded him daily that he was no longer a governor, only a number in a cell block. His arrogance turned to bitterness and bitterness to despair. He spent hours staring through the barred windows, haunted by memories of applause, wealth, and luxury. Amelia's absence cut him deeply. She never visited, not even once. Letters he wrote went unanswered. His children, ashamed of his legacy, changed their names to escape his shadow. The world outside moved on. Riverton slowly rebuilt under new leadership, and Victor's name was mentioned only in classrooms as a warning of greed. He had everything: power, wealth, admiration, and lost it all. Karma had not just punished him, it had stripped him of his dignity, leaving him to rot in obscurity. Months turned into years, and Victor realized something more painful than prison life. He was forgotten. In the beginning, journalists swarmed outside the gates of his prison, reporting on his every move. But over time his name faded from the headlines. New scandals, new leaders, and new battles took center stage, while Victor became nothing more than yesterday's story. The people of Riverton no longer cared about him. Children who once sang his campaign songs now learned about him in textbooks as a cautionary tale. The younger generation knew his name only as a synonym for betrayal. Inside the prison, Victor's health began to decline. His strong voice, once able to shake crowds, now cracked with age and regret. His once sharp mind grew clouded with bitterness. He replayed his rise and fall endlessly, unable to accept how quickly the world had moved on without him. When he requested interviews to clear his name, reporters refused. His attempts to write a memoir were rejected by publishers. No one wanted to hear excuses. No one wanted his redemption story. The silence outside his prison walls was more devastating than any insult. Victor Moretti had become irrelevant. At night, Victor often lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his cell. His mind drifted back to the promises he once made. He remembered the faces of the poor farmers who trusted him, the teachers who believed in his words, the sick children in hospitals he had vowed to support. Their images haunted him like ghosts, whispering accusations into the darkness. He realized that his corruption had not just destroyed his own life, it had stolen futures. Roads left unfinished meant children never reached schools. Hospitals starved of funding meant lives cut short. His betrayal wasn't abstract. It was carved into the graves of his people. Sometimes he muttered apologies to the air, hoping the ghosts would forgive him. Other times his pride returned, insisting he had only done what every politician did. But deep down he knew his choices had been deliberate, his greed intentional. The walls echoed with his torment. Fellow inmates mocked him when they heard him whisper to himself, calling him Governor of Regret. The title stuck, spreading like fire through the prison. Victor had ruled with arrogance, but in prison he was ruled by memory and shame. Victor longed for family, believing his children would one day visit him, perhaps bring him comfort. But when the prison announced visiting hours, no familiar faces appeared. His letters went unanswered, and the silence burned more than any punishment. One day he managed to glimpse a newspaper smuggled into the prison. His heart froze when he saw his eldest son on the front page, not as a supporter but as a rising politician. The headline praised him as the voice of integrity, a man determined to cleanse Riverton of corruption and rebuild trust. The article made no mention of Victor. His son had publicly disowned him, declaring, "I am not my father. His sins are his alone." The words cut like knives. Victor, once desperate for a legacy, realized his very name had become poison. His children would only succeed by erasing him. The betrayal of blood hurt more than Leonard's treachery, more than the protests, more than prison itself. Victor had lost not just power but his lineage. His children's success was built on the rubble of his disgrace. The man who once dreamed of dynasties was now a ghost even to his own bloodline. Years later, the prison warden allowed Victor a rare privilege. To speak at a rehabilitation seminar for young inmates, it was a cruel irony. Once he had commanded entire nations with his speeches, now he stood before a dozen criminals in orange uniforms. At first he tried to summon his old charisma, but his voice trembled. Gone was the fire, the passion, the certainty. Instead he spoke haltingly, his words laced with sorrow. He confessed his sins, described his rise and fall, and begged the young men not to follow in his footsteps. The room was silent when he finished. For the first time in decades, Victor's words were genuine. Not polished lies, not rehearsed speeches, but raw truth. And yet, instead of applause, there was only pity. The young men clapped politely, not out of inspiration but because they saw a broken old man clinging to meaning. When Victor returned to his cell, he realized that was his final speech. Once he had spoken to millions, now he spoke to 12. The stage was gone, the lights were gone, and so was the world that once worshipped him. His voice, once his greatest weapon, had become nothing more than an echo. Victor's end came quietly, not with the grandeur he once believed he deserved. His health worsened, and he was transferred to the prison infirmary. Rumors spread that he might not survive the year. One evening, as he struggled for breath, a guard switched on the television in the infirmary. To Victor's horror, the screen showed a national celebration, Riverton's Independence Day. The new president gave a speech about rebuilding the nation after corruption. The crowd cheered, waving flags, filled with hope. Victor strained to listen, waiting for his name, for some acknowledgement of his role in history. But his name was never spoken. The speech ended with a line that pierced him deeply. "The era of thieves is over. Riverton belongs to the people again." The crowd roared, and fireworks lit the sky. Victor's heart sank. He realized that his legacy had been erased, not remembered as a lesson but discarded as filth. His humiliation was complete. Not only had he fallen, but the world had moved on without him. As the television flickered, Victor closed his eyes, knowing he would die not as a leader, but as a forgotten disgrace. As Victor's health failed, the prison halls carried whispers of his condition. Inmates who once mocked him now spoke of him with morbid fascination. Guards discussed whether the disgraced politician would live to see another season, yet outside the prison walls few even remembered him. Victor's nights were restless. He dreamt of his glory days, cheering crowds, flashing cameras, his name sung like a hymn. But every dream ended the same way, with angry faces, chants of betrayal, and Leonard's cold smile as he revealed the evidence. He woke drenched in sweat, clutching his thin blanket like a shield. The silence around him grew heavier with each passing day. Amelia never came. His children never wrote. Riverton thrived without him, led by those who had risen from the ashes of his corruption. The new leaders built roads, funded schools, and delivered on promises he had abandoned. Victor realized his legacy had been rewritten. He was no longer part of Riverton's progress. He was the stain that made the people demand honesty. His existence had become a footnote in the nation's history, and soon even that footnote would fade. One rainy afternoon, a visitor finally came. It wasn't Amelia, nor his children. It was Clara, the widow who had once started the protests with her sign in the square. She was older now, her face lined with hardship, but her spirit remained unbroken. Victor was stunned. "Why are you here?" he asked weakly. Clara's eyes burned with quiet fire. "I came to see the man who stole years of my life," she said. "My husband died because the hospital had no medicine. My son grew up hungry because the roads you promised were never built. I came to tell you that I forgive you." Victor's mouth opened, but no words came. Forgiveness was the last thing he expected. Clara leaned closer. "But forgiveness does not erase what you did. Your punishment is not prison. It is living long enough to see how little you matter." She left without another word. Victor sat frozen, her voice echoing in his heart. Forgiveness did not bring him peace, it crushed him even more. For the first time, he understood that his punishment was not the loss of wealth, power, or family. His true punishment was irrelevance. Winter crept into the prison. Victor's body grew frail, his voice a whisper, his once proud figure hunched and forgotten. The infirmary was cold, its peeling walls and flickering lights a cruel reminder of his fall from grandeur. One night, as snow fell outside, Victor's breathing grew shallow. No family stood at his bedside, no loyal followers prayed for him, no nation mourned. A guard noticed his struggle but did not rush. Victor was just another old man dying in prison. His final thoughts drifted back to the crowd that had once roared his name. He remembered raising his hand, promising a better future. He remembered the cheers, the tears of hope, the people who believed in him. For a fleeting second he wished he could return to that moment, not to taste power again, but to keep his promises. But it was too late. Victor Moretti, once hailed as Riverton's savior, died quietly in the night. His death made no headlines. The world carried on, and Riverton awoke the next day stronger, freer, and lighter without the burden of his shadow. When the news broke, it was a single sentence buried deep in the papers. Former Governor Victor Moretti dies in prison at 67. No front-page headlines, no breaking news segments. For the nation it was nothing more than a passing note. His funeral was small, attended by no family. A state once forced to honor him ignored his passing entirely. Only a few prison staff watched as his coffin was lowered into the ground. No flowers, no speeches, no tears. The man who once commanded millions was buried like a stranger. His name, once shouted in every household, was barely spoken. His children never came, his wife never sent a message. Even in death he was abandoned. The grave bore only a simple marker with his name and date of birth and death. No titles, no honors, no legacy. He had dreamed of statues, of books written about him, of generations remembering his greatness. Instead, his name became a warning whispered in classrooms. Beware of greed, for even the mighty can fall. Victor Moretti was gone, and Riverton barely noticed. Years later, the story of Victor Moretti lived on. But not as he had once hoped. His name appeared in textbooks as the embodiment of corruption. Teachers used his tale to warn students of greed. Politicians invoked his downfall as a reminder that no power lasts forever. Riverton thrived without him. Roads were rebuilt, schools flourished, and hospitals saved lives. The people, once betrayed, now trusted again. But only because they remembered the pain of Victor's lies. His legacy was not greatness. His legacy was a lesson. In the end, karma had done its work with ruthless precision. Victor was humiliated not just in life but in history. His memory became a curse, his fall an eternal echo reminding the world that betrayal always carries a price. His story ends, but his punishment lives on, etched not in stone statues, but in the collective memory of a nation. And so, dear viewer, remember this tale well. The corrupt may rise, but they always fall. If you want more stories of power, betrayal, and karma's justice, don't forget to subscribe for the next one.